Hello friends, my name is JJ. So these are a marshmallow candy known as circus peanuts. They're not that popular these days, but back in the 1950s they were quite beloved by middle-class American school children. And these, of course, are Cheerios, an oat-based cereal that has been one of America's most popular breakfast foods since their debut in 1941. In the early 1960s, a crafty employee of the General Mills Food Corporation had a brainstorm on how they could sell more of these things to children. What if we put some circus peanuts in there? In those somewhat less nutritious conscious times, this seemed like a perfectly reasonable breakfast proposal. But General Mills also knew that you couldn't sell things to kids without a little bit of razzle-dazzle. Cereals had to have a theme, so what would be the theme of this new marshmallow-based cereal? The answer was as random as it was timeless: Lucky Charms. I've always been fascinated by the idea of different sets of things and how different cultures will put different things into those sets. Since its debut in 1964, the marshmallows in the Lucky Charms cereal have come in a set of shapes that it's been assumed Americans will recognize as Lucky Charms. The specific shapes that comprise the official Lucky Charms canon have fluctuated a bit over the decades, but I feel like the core set is reflected by this song I remember hearing a lot on TV growing up.
Heart stars and horseshoes, clovers and blue moons, pots of gold and rainbows, and me red balloons.
What a random set of things when you think about it, eh? We got like planetary objects, barnyard equipment, plants, currency, organs, party decorations, and weather. So today, I thought it might be fun to go through this list and explore the question of how. How did America get to the point where this random assortment of things could be so recognizable as symbols of luck that General Mills could make a whole cereal based around them? All right, so let's start with the Clover. So, as we all know, in addition to the literal Lucky Charms theme, the Lucky Charms cereal also has a bit of an Irish motif, as embodied by their beloved mascot character, Lucky the Leprechaun. Fun fact, the General Mills people were once afraid that Lucky would offend the substantial Irish population of New England, so for a while, they replaced Lucky with a less ethnic wizard character in that part of the US, which only makes sense because in some ways the association of the Irish with luck actually has a darker origin than you might think. Historically, it has always been much more of a thing that Americans thought about the Irish rather than something that the Irish thought about themselves. And although the exact origins of this stereotype aren't that well known, the leading theory seems to be that it started out as something derogatory. During the Great Wave of Irish immigration to America in the 19th century, Irish people were often seen as dumb and lazy, and therefore whenever anything good happened to an Irish person, or they were successful in any way, people said it was just dopey luck. This also played on a stereotype that the Irish people were very simple-minded and superstitious and believed in magic and fairies and all of that. And it seems like over time, all of this kind of got blurred together into a more sentimental stereotype about Irish people being lucky and being obsessed with good luck charms in a more charming way. And now, even when you go to Ireland itself, as I did a few years ago, you will see that their souvenir shops are all crammed with stuff that panders to overseas stereotypes about the luck of the Irish. And the lead example is, of course, the shamrock, which is now basically the world's go-to symbol of Irish luckiness. Shamrocks are the leaves of the white clover flower, which is a very common plant that grows all over the world. They normally have leaves of 3, so spotting a freakish 4-leaf one is a pretty simple example of humans associating an unusual thing with being an omen of exceptional circumstances. According to this book, the shamrock was established as a mainstream symbol of Ireland in the late 17th century, largely to accompany the other plant symbols for the other component parts of the United Kingdom. But why the humble shamrock specifically? Well, the big theory you most often read is that it stems from a popular folk legend relating to Ireland's most famous Christian holy man, Saint Patrick, who died in the 5th century. St. Patrick wasn't all that famous in his own time, but he became this figure of great veneration and myth-making by Irish nationalists many centuries later. And one legend that emerged at some point long after his death was that he taught the simple people of Ireland about the majesty of the Holy Trinity by holding up a clover and explaining that just as the simple shamrock has 3 leaves, so too does the Lord manifest in 3 different ways. Now, like I said, this story is almost certainly certainly false, and even the story about the influence of the story might be false as well, which really gets to one of the main anticlimactic themes of today's video. When it comes to deeply ingrained cultural symbols, more often than not, their true origins are basically fundamentally unknowable. A lot of symbols have been around for so long, it is very difficult to objectively state when they first started to be a thing, or what, if anything, they were originally intended to mean. This is simply because ancient historical records are so often so sketchy, and because so many old-timey historians just didn't care to document much beyond kings and wars. But because we humans crave tidy little explanations, it is very easy to find all sorts of apocryphal origin stories on the internet for just about anything. But these are very often wrong, and you should always be wary of any explanation of anything that is just too cute and perfect, because once you start cracking open the actual history books, as opposed to funonlinefacts.com, you will find that things are never quite so simple. All right, so how about the star? Pretty much every society has venerated the stars as symbols of the world beyond our own. Christian culture, in particular, has long used the stars as a metaphor for heaven and the intimidating grandness of God's creation. Today, the Lucky Charm star looks like this, a 5-pointed star with a little shooting star tail. Shooting stars, of course, being another example of something that's easy to venerate as some sort of fortuitous omen, just because they're so rare. But anyway, for a long time, the Lucky Charm star looked like this, a 6-pointed star. My assumption would be that this was just an easier marshmallow shape to make, because by the time Lucky Charms debuted in the early 60s, the 6-pointed star had long ago fallen out of fashion as America's favorite star shape. I mean, just consider some of the other beloved American star-shaped icons of the time, like the Hollywood Walk of Fame, or the Carl's Jr. logo, or of course, the American flag itself. In fact, as I recently learned on the popular podcast 99% Invisible, the popularity of 5-pointed stars in American culture is almost certainly a result of the American flag, which was in turn a byproduct of the ingenuity or possibly laziness of famed American flag seamstress Betsy Ross. Supposedly, old Betsy taught the founding fathers that 5-pointed stars are actually much faster to make, since if you fold a piece of cloth this wise, you can actually make one with just a single snip of the scissors. Aha! And in an era before factories, this was a very helpful tip indeed. Since then, we have gradually come to mostly associate the 6-pointed star with the Star of David, the symbol of the Jewish people, though this is actually a surprisingly recent thing. The Encyclopedia Britannica notes that it's a symbol that has no biblical or Talmudic authority, but rather has its roots in secular mythicism dating back to ancient times. The Jews just sort of consciously made it their thing over the course of the last 200 years or so as part of what sounds like a conscious branding exercise to improve group solidarity. Rainbows are so beautiful and weird and rare, it is not hard to imagine why most primitive societies would interpret them as a message from God. In Christian culture, they are most closely associated with the story of Noah in Genesis, where God says after the flood,
I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth.
And ever since, it has been a popular symbol of divine benevolence. In medieval paintings, it was not at all uncommon to see depictions of Jesus either sitting on a rainbow or encircled by a rainbow, which is interesting because, of course, in modern America, the rainbow is increasingly seen as an LGBT symbol. But I recently learned that in parts of Europe, the rainbow flag is a symbol associated with peace, which is linked to the more traditional Christian symbology. And of course, as we all know, at the end of the rainbow is a... Most human civilizations seem to have venerated gold, whose glittering yellow beauty reminds us of the sun and the stars, and thus heaven. The kingdom of Lydia in modern-day Turkey is often given credit as being the first place to use gold coins as currency over 2,500 years ago, a practice which of course then spread all over the world and is still even with us in some form to this day. The idea of keeping a bunch of gold coins in a pot, however, is another explicitly Irish thing associated with leprechauns, those mythical Irish elf beasts. In 1888, an Irish-American author named David Russell McAnally published a very influential book about Irish folklore in the US called Irish Wonders, which featured a bunch of interviews with Irish people sharing various myths and legends about the old country, including a whole chapter about leprechauns. And it's been said that a lot of our modern stereotypes about leprechauns come from this book, including the idea that they hide pots of gold in various places that humans can never seem to find. Since mythical creatures are often manifestations of cultural anxieties, one assumes that this whole business of leprechauns and their hidden gold is a reflection of the historic poverty of Ireland, in which stories about enormous stashes of hidden money would have really captured people's imaginations. The heart is, of course, the leading symbol of love in American culture, and this once again has its roots in Christian iconography from the Middle Ages. The symbology books that I read all generally said that since the heart is the most important organ in the body, it was first used in Western culture as a symbol representing importance. I mean, we still kind of think this way when we say things like, let's get to the heart of the matter. But then, as a certain Christian idea of love became seen as the most important purpose of man's existence, this is what the heart gradually came to symbolize. Explicitly venerating the heart of Jesus as a symbol of the purest form of love is a Christian tradition dating back to the 11th century, according to this book on the history of heart symbology. But things didn't really kick off for our purposes until the Counter-Reformation of the 16th and 17th centuries, when it became popular for Catholics to make depictions of Jesus and Mary with exposed hearts, or just draw their disembodied hearts hanging out on their own as part of a general ratcheting up of Catholic iconography. And it seems to be from these somewhat anatomically dubious depictions that we get the modern idea of a stylized heart representing secular romantic love, depicted not only in cereal marshmallows, but of course all sorts of other sugary goodies that might ironically cause a lot of heart problems down the road. Now, while moon symbolism is of course a big thing in its own right, the Lucky Charms people very specifically went with a blue moon, which is a bit of a more narrowly specific cultural reference. It is an allusion to the saying, once in a blue moon, which is of course a popular way of saying not very common. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, this is a British saying in origin, with the earliest documented use of the phrase being in 1821. And as is often the case with these kinds of expressions, there has been a lot of debate as to whether blue moon actually refers to something specific, or if it's just a kind of goofy saying to imply something absurdly unlikely, like when we say, when pigs fly. This book, Who Put the Butter in Butterfly, notes that while some people use the term blue moon to describe the second full moon of the calendar year, there is no evidence to indicate that this meaning existed when the phrase was coined. So, of all the Lucky Charms we're talking about today, I feel like horseshoes are the most ambiguous. The idea of horseshoes was first invented by the Romans, who also popularized the idea of paved roads. A horse's hooves will crack if forced to pound down on hard stone all day, so out of compassion for the poor horsies, they decided to instead nail pieces of metal into their feet. Now, horseshoes are kind of rare and cool-looking objects, and I feel like simple aesthetic fascination with them has probably played a large role in why people like keeping them as souvenirs, particularly people who might not come into contact with horses all that much. I remember when I was a kid, my grandfather had a horseshoe nailed to the wall of his garage, pointing up like this, because he said that way the luck would come out of the endpoints. And symbologists, for their part, generally speculate that the reasons why we consider horseshoes lucky owes something to their vaguely crescent shape, given that the crescent, and the crescent moon in particular, have been symbols revered by many different cultures for many thousands of years. These days, we associate the crescent mostly with Islam, but apparently, much like the Star of David, there is no real religious basis for doing this. For reasons that aren't entirely clear, the crescent simply became the symbol of the Ottoman Empire sometime in the 15th century or so. And since that empire considered itself synonymous with Islam, this helped make the symbol of themselves and the symbol of their religion kind of one and the same. And even though that empire is now gone, the tradition of the Islamic crescent continues to be honored by the various countries that emerged from its collapse. You might have noticed, however, that the Islamic fundamentalists never use the crescent in their symbolism because they consider it a secular pagan symbol with no relevance to Islam, and they're not wrong. And finally, we get to the most recent Lucky Charm, both in terms of its addition to the cereal canon and its inclusion to the culture more broadly, the red balloon. Balloons of the sort we know today have been around since the early 20th century, a reflection of the growing availability of rubber in Western countries, thanks to good old imperialism. Fun fact, previously the term balloon was only used to describe these things, while these things were called toy balloons, which is why Sinatra has that somewhat awkward line in You Make Me Feel So Young.
I like to go and bounce the moon just like a toy balloon.
After World War II, advancements in synthetic rubber, as well as an increased availability of helium, saw balloons enter American culture like never before. They became the go-to cheap novelty to give away to kids. They started handing out these things everywhere, at the circus, at McDonald's, even at the dentist. A quintessential object of bourgeois consumerism, you could say, for both good and bad. Anyway, one result of the balloon revolution is that we soon began to associate balloons as being like the quintessential symbol of childlike innocence, with red balloons in particular becoming the most popular visual shorthand, particularly in the 1980s. You can think of things like how the monster in It uses a red balloon to lure the kids, or how Commander Keen collects red balloons, or how Nina sings about 99 red balloons. And the reason for all of this is almost certainly because of a very popular 1956 short film from France called Les Ballons Rouges. It won an Oscar that year and tells an affecting tale of friendship between boy and balloon. That movie did a lot to consolidate the idea of red as like the default balloon color in the popular imagination, ultimately making it a no-brainer as to what color the first Lucky Charms balloon marshmallow should be when it was finally added in 1989. So in conclusion, one of the big takeaways from researching the Lucky Charms canon has just been a renewed appreciation for how much of human history has been dominated by very simplistic and superstitious understandings of the world. Like, it is amazing how many of the backstories of historical symbols that we might assume have some sort of deep or thoughtful significance aren't actually rooted in much more than just people thought this thing looked cool. Do you have an interesting example of some lesser known symbol of luck or good fortune from some non-American or non-Christian culture? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.